Before we begin our journey into a world of unparalleled crime and audacity, an essential disclaimer. The narrative you are about to experience is a compilation of facts, testimonies, and historical accounts gathered from a multitude of sources, including federal court records, declassified documents, biographies, and investigative reports. This presentation is crafted with the sole intention of delivering a comprehensive and accurate account to you, the viewer, for educational and informational purposes. It seeks not to glorify, but to illuminate the intricate and often dark pathways of one of the most significant criminal lives of the 20th century. Our story revolves around Carlos Lehder, a name that became synonymous with the brazen flow of cocaine and the violent reshaping of the drug trade. If you are fascinated by deep, factual explorations of true crime that delve beyond the headlines, then please consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications. Now, let us step back in time to the origins of an empire built on white powder. Our story begins not with the blaring sirens of a police raid or the sun-drenched chaos of a Colombian airstrip, but in the relative quiet of a Colombian city known more for coffee than for cartels. On the 6th of September, 1949, in the city of Armenia, Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born. His father, Wilhelm Lehder, was a German engineer who had settled in Colombia, and his mother, Helma Rivas, was a local Colombian woman. This dual heritage, this fusion of European and Latin American blood, would profoundly shape the man he was to become, creating a personal identity crisis that he would later attempt to resolve through grand, often delusional, political and criminal ambitions. His early childhood was fractured by the separation of his parents, a pivotal event that set him on a path of dislocation and rootlessness. His mother, seeking a new life, made the monumental decision to emigrate to the United States, taking a young Carlos with her to the bustling, diverse, and often overwhelming borough of Queens in New York City. They settled in Jackson Heights, a neighborhood that was a world away from the familiar landscapes of Armenia. It was here, as a teenager, that the first tangible signs of a criminal inclination emerged. He was an outsider, struggling with English, navigating a complex cultural mosaic, and feeling the sharp sting of not belonging. This alienation festered, morphing into rebellion. He dropped out of school and plunged into the petty criminal underworld of New York in the late 1960s, graduating from minor delinquency to stealing cars. It was a small-time operation, but it was his first real business, his first lesson in supply and demand, risk and reward. In 1973, this apprenticeship in American crime was cut short when he was arrested for selling stolen vehicles. The American judicial system, which he would grow to despise, handed him a sentence to be served at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. It was within those cold, imposing walls that his life's trajectory was irrevocably altered. Prison, for many, is an end. For Carlos Lehder, it was a beginning. It was a university of crime where he met a fellow inmate, a quiet but ambitious Colombian named George Jung. It was Jung who opened Lehder's eyes to the burgeoning potential of a specific commodity cocaine. While others saw it as an expensive luxury for the elite, Lehder, with his visionary and restless mind, saw something else entirely. He saw an industry. He saw a pipeline. He saw a revolution. He absorbed everything Jung knew about the logistics of smuggling marijuana and began to apply his own, far grander, logic to the problem of cocaine. The existing methods were small-scale, relying on mullahs, carrying small amounts on commercial flights. It was inefficient and risky. Lehder, dreaming on a Napoleonic scale, conceived of a better way, a highway across the Caribbean. He imagined a fleet of airplanes, bypassing traditional routes entirely, moving not kilos, but tons. He was released from prison in 1975, a man possessed by a single, transformative idea. He returned to Colombia not as a failed car thief, but as a prophet of a new criminal era, ready to build an empire from the ground up and challenge the very foundations of American power. Returning to his homeland with a blueprint for revolution etched into his mind, Carlos Lehder found a Colombia ripe for his particular brand of ambition. The country was already a nexus for the nascent cocaine trade, but it was fragmented, operated by numerous small, time traffickers lacking the vision and audacity to scale their operations to a world, historic level. Later, fresh from his American incarceration and infused with the grand logistical ideas brainstormed with George Jung, was the catalyst it needed. He did not merely want to be a player in the game. He wanted to redesign the game itself. His first step was to reconnect with his roots in Armenia, using his family's connections to establish himself. He understood that to build his empire, he needed capital, and he started by doing what he knew best, but on a larger scale, smuggling stolen cars from the United States back to Colombia. This venture provided the essential seed money, but his gaze was fixed on a far more lucrative horizon. He reunited with George Jung upon the latter's release from prison, and together they formed a partnership that would become the stuff of criminal legend. Jung, with his established connections to cocaine suppliers in Colombia, handled the procurement, while Lehder focused on his grand vision, the transportation network. He identified a critical choke point in the existing smuggling routes, the Bahamas, the archipelago's hundreds of islands and cays, its notoriously lax regulations, and its proximity to the United States made it the perfect logistical hub. He zeroed in on a specific island, Norman's Cay, a secluded paradise that would become the physical manifestation of his dream. In the late 1970s, he began a systematic and ruthless campaign to take control of the island. He used a combination of strategic purchases and outright intimidation to force out most of the local residents and other foreign property owners. He established a base of operations complete with airstrips, hangars, warehouses, and a fleet of small aircraft. Norman's Cay was transformed from a tranquil tourist spot into a fortified, sovereign territory for La Corporación, the name Lehder gave to his organization. This was not just a business, it was a statement. On Norman's Cay, he was the law. His pilots, trained and fearless, would fly loads of cocaine from Colombia, refuel at the island, and then make the short, final hop to deserted airstrips in Florida. The efficiency was staggering. Where others moved kilograms, Lehder moved hundreds and then thousands of kilos. The sheer volume of cocaine flooding into the United States began to fundamentally alter the drug's place in American culture, moving it from an exclusive party drug for the wealthy to a more widely available, though still expensive, commodity. Lehder's success at Norman's Cay made him incredibly wealthy and powerful, but it also fed a growing megalomania. He began to see himself not just as a trafficker, but as a revolutionary leader. He started to espouse a bizarre, radical political ideology, a fusion of anti-American sentiment, pan-Latin American nationalism, and admiration for historical figures like Adolf Hitler and Argentine President Juan Perón. He saw the cocaine trade not as mere criminal enterprise, but as a form of economic and psychological warfare against the United States, a country he felt had wronged him personally during his imprisonment. He began pouring millions of his drug profits into funding a nascent political movement in Colombia known as the Latin Nationalist Movement, or Movimiento Nacional Latino, using his newspaper, Quindio Today, to spread his incendiary views. He was no longer operating in the shadows. He was building a public profile, a dangerous game for a man whose entire empire was illegal. He lived flamboyantly on his island kingdom, throwing lavish parties, surrounded by bodyguards, and behaving like a head of state. This very public rise, however, was drawing the intense and unwanted attention of both the American Drug Enforcement Administration and the Bahamian government. The idyllic facade of Norman's Cay was beginning to crack under the weight of its own notoriety, setting the stage for a confrontation that would force the architect of this cocaine highway to abandon his throne and seek new alliances, leading him directly into the orbit of the most fearsome criminal organization the modern world had ever seen, the Medellín Cartel. The golden era of Norman's Cay, while spectacularly profitable, could not last forever. Carlos Lehder's very public flaunting of his illicit kingdom had turned his secluded paradise into a glaring beacon for law enforcement. The DEA, in collaboration with the Bahamian authorities, began to close the net. Raids and increased surveillance made the once secure transit point increasingly hazardous. The final blow came with a shift in the political winds in the Bahamas. The newly elected government, under Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling, was under immense pressure from the United States to clean up the island's reputation and dismantle the drug operations that had flourished there. Lehder was forced to abandon his island fortress, a retreat that marked the end of his solo reign, but by no means the end of his influence. This expulsion, however, coincided with a strategic evolution in the cocaine trade itself. The incredible success of his transportation model had proven the demand for cocaine in the United States was virtually limitless, but supplying it required a level of organization, violence, and political protection that was beyond the scope of any single smuggler, even one as capable as Lehder. It was at this critical juncture that his path converged with that of Pablo Escobar, George Luis Oco, and the Rodriguez Origila brothers. These men were not just traffickers, They were industrialists of crime, and they recognized in Lehder a revolutionary asset. His air bridge system was the missing piece in their puzzle. Instead of seeing him as a rival, they invited him into their nascent consortium, which would soon become infamous as the Medellín Cartel. Lehder, now without his base and facing intensified pressure, understood the necessity of this alliance. He became a founding partner and a key logistics mastermind for the cartel. His role was formalized. He was their primary transporter, the man responsible for moving the cartel's mountainous product from the hidden laboratories in the Colombian jungle to the wholesale distributors in the United States. For this service, he was paid an unprecedented fee, reportedly between $3,000 and $4,000 per kilo, with the cartel moving tens of thousands of kilos every month. Lehder's personal wealth exploded into the hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions of dollars. This partnership supercharged the cocaine epidemic in America, flooding the streets with unprecedented quantities of high-purity cocaine. The Medellín Cartel, with Lehder's logistical genius, became a corporate entity of crime, a multinational corporation with a product more addictive and profitable than any other. Lehder, now insulated by the cartel's immense power and ruthlessness, felt emboldened to escalate his political activities. He bought a sprawling estate, Hacienda Naples, which he transformed into a personal fiefdom, complete with a private zoo, dinosaur statues, and multiple airstrips. It was here that his ideology took its most bizarre and public form. He hosted large gatherings, not just for cartel members, but for politicians, intellectuals, and anyone who would listen to his rambling manifestos. He founded a political party, the Latin Nationalist Movement, and used his newspaper to publish long, incoherent diatribes against the United States, often framing the cocaine trade as a righteous war to liberate Latin America from Yankee imperialism. He even attempted to broker a deal with the Colombian government, the infamous plata o plomo, silver or lead, offering to pay off the nation's entire foreign debt in exchange for political legitimacy and the cessation of extradition treaties with the United States. This very public posturing made him a folk hero to some poor Colombians who saw his wealth and defiance as a triumph, but it also made him a primary target. To the United States government, he was no longer just a drug trafficker. He was a national security threat, a narco-terrorist who was openly declaring war. His face was now on wanted posters across 2 continents, and the hunt for him became one of the highest priorities for American federal agencies. The man who had built an invisible highway in the sky was now one of the most visible and wanted men in the world. A status that guaranteed his life of luxury and power was balanced on the edge of a knife, with forces gathering that would ensure his reign would end not with a negotiation, but with a violent and definitive conclusion. The zenith of Carlos Lehder's power within the Medellín Cartel was a period of almost unimaginable wealth and influence. But it was also the prelude to his precipitous fall, a descent accelerated by his own increasingly erratic and politically volatile behavior. While his partners, particularly Pablo Escobar, understood the value of discretion, using their wealth to build a measure of public goodwill through housing projects and community investments, a strategy known as plomo. Lehder chose a different, far more confrontational path. He seemed to believe his own propaganda, viewing himself not as a criminal baron, but as a revolutionary leader whose time had come. This grandiosity blinded him to the practical realities of his situation. The United States government had formally indicted him, and his name was at the top of the Justice Department's most wanted list. The indictment was not just for drug trafficking. It was a sprawling racketeering case that painted him as the central figure in a criminal enterprise that was waging war against America. The pressure was not only coming from the North. Within Colombia, the political landscape was shifting. The infamous extradition treaty of 1979, which allowed Colombians to be sent to the United States for trial, became the cartel's existential nightmare, and they declared total war on the Colombian state in response, a period known as La Violencia. This was not a war Lehder could win with airplanes and money. It was a brutal, bloody conflict fought with car bombs, assassinations, and terror. Lehder, despite his revolutionary rhetoric, was not primarily a soldier. He was a logistics mastermind, and the environment was becoming hostile to his particular genius. The cartel's operations were forced underground. Their once smooth transportation networks disrupted by intense law enforcement scrutiny on both sides of the Caribbean. His own security became a crushing obsession. He moved constantly between a series of fortified safe houses, surrounded by a private army of bodyguards, living in a state of perpetual paranoia. The legendary Hacienda Naples, once a symbol of his triumphant power, became a fortified compound, a gilded cage from which he could no longer freely operate. The American and Colombian authorities were closing in, using every tool at their disposal. They tracked his financial movements, intercepted his communications, and turned the heat on his associates, flipping them into informants. The man who had once owned an entire island and commanded a private air force was now a fugitive, his world shrinking with each passing day. The final, decisive blow came from within the cartel's own ranks. The relentless pressure from the government, the rewards offered for information, and the sheer violence of the war they were waging began to create fissures in their solidarity. It is believed that information, a crucial tip about Lehder's movements and one of his key hideouts, was ultimately provided by someone within the cartel's vast network. A betrayal born from the desperate realization that Lehder's very public persona had become a liability that was endangering the entire organization. The net, woven from years of investigation, international cooperation, and internal betrayal, was finally ready to be pulled tight. The hunt for Carlos Lehder, the co-founder of the Medellín Cartel, the self-proclaimed revolutionary, and the architect of the cocaine highway, was reaching its climax in the rugged, coffee, growing landscape of his home department of Quindio, setting the stage for a dramatic end to his years on the run, an end that would not come in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, almost anticlimactic surrender that would send shockwaves through the criminal underworld and mark the beginning of the end for the Medellín Cartel's unchallenged dominance. The final act of Carlos Lehder's life as a free man began not with a dramatic shootout, but with the patient, meticulous work of a special joint task force of the Colombian National Police, acting on intelligence that was the culmination of countless dead ends, paid informants, and technological surveillance. For months, he had been a ghost, a rumor moving through the Andean foothills. His presence felt only in the fear he instilled in the local populace and the loyalty he commanded from his ever-dwindling circle of protectors. The breakthrough came on a seemingly ordinary day in February 1987. The task force, led by Colonel Hugo Martinez, had pinpointed a heavily fortified ranch near the town of Rio Sucio in the department of Caldas. The location was classic Lehder, remote, defensible, and surrounded by the rugged terrain he knew well from his childhood. The ranch, known as La Loma, was a fortress equipped with early warning systems, armed sentries, and tunnels that provided potential escape routes. The Colombian authorities, determined to avoid a bloody confrontation that could allow him to slip away yet again, planned their assault with precision. On the morning of February 4th, 1987, a large contingent of police and army troops surrounded the property. What happened next defied the expectations of a man known for his revolutionary bravado. There was no last stand. There was no dramatic final broadcast from his newspaper. After a brief and seemingly perfunctory exchange of gunfire, the resistance crumbled. Lehder, realizing the futility of his situation and perhaps calculating his final move, surrendered without further violence. The image of his capture is stark, a disheveled man, his once confident demeanor replaced by a look of wary resignation, being led away by uniformed officers. The news spread across the globe instantly. Carlos Lehder, the myth, the Kingpin, the revolutionary, was now a prisoner. His arrest was hailed as the most significant victory to date in the war on drugs, a tangible symbol that even the most powerful and elusive criminals could be brought to earth. The immediate and fiercely contested question was what to do with him. The United States government immediately filed for his extradition, desperate to try him on their soil for crimes committed against their nation. The Medellín Cartel, however, was not about to let their founding member, a man who possessed an encyclopedia of their secrets, testify in an American courtroom. They launched a terrifying campaign of intimidation, known as extraditables, targeting judges, politicians, and journalists, promising more violence if Lehder was sent north. For a tense period, Lehder sat in a Colombian jail, a pawn in a deadly game between the cartel and the state. The situation was resolved with a tragic and pivotal event, the assassination of Colombian Attorney General Carlos Mauro Hoyos in January 1988, a murder explicitly carried out to halt Lehder's extradition. This act of supreme violence backfired catastrophically for the cartel. It so horrified the Colombian establishment that it steeled their resolve. The government, under President Virgilio Barco, decided that Lehder was too dangerous to keep in the country. The risk of him being broken out of prison or corrupting the judicial process was too great. The order for his extradition was signed, and so, in a tightly guarded, clandestine operation, Carlos Lehder was whisked out of Colombia and placed on a military flight to the United States, where he would face a justice system he had spent his adult life vilifying and evading. The man who had declared economic war on America was now entirely at its mercy, setting the stage for one of the most sensational and consequential federal trials in American history. A trial where Lehder would be forced to confront the full weight of the empire he had sought to undermine. The trial of the United States of America versus Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas, held in a heavily fortified federal courtroom in Jacksonville, Florida, was far more than a simple criminal proceeding. It was a theatrical reckoning, a dramatic clash between the unyielding force of the American judicial system and the defiant ideology of the man who had dared to weaponize cocaine against it. The year was 1988, and the atmosphere was thick with tension and unprecedented security measures. The prosecution, led by a determined team of federal attorneys, presented a case that was monumental in its scope and detail. A meticulously constructed narrative of Lehder's rise from a small, time car thief to the logistical mastermind of the Medellín Cartel. They painted a picture of a criminal genius who had industrialized drug smuggling, presenting as evidence flight logs, financial records, seized account ledgers, and the testimonies of a parade of former associates, pilots, and money launderers who had once been part of his empire. The star witness for the prosecution was none other than George Jung, Lehder's old prison mate and former partner, whose testimony provided the jury with an intimate, insider's view of the genesis of the cocaine highway and Lehder's singular role in its creation. Jung detailed their partnership, the acquisition of Norman's Cay, and the sheer scale of their ambition, his words serving to humanize the myth and translate Lehder's legend into admissible evidence. The defense, in contrast, pursued a strategy that was as unconventional as their client. Rather than simply disputing the facts, they attempted to put the United States government itself on trial. They argued that Lehder was a political revolutionary, a freedom fighter for Latin America, and that his actions were motivated by a deeply held, albeit radical, political belief system, not mere greed. They portrayed him as a victim of American imperialism, a man being persecuted for his anti-American views rather than for any specific crimes. Lehder himself, seizing this platform with the same fervor he had used for his newspaper editorials, often disrupted the proceedings, delivering long, rambling speeches to the jury denouncing the judge, the prosecutors, and the American government as corrupt and oppressive. He claimed the trial was a sham, a political lynching designed to silence a powerful critic. This strategy, while consistent with his lifelong persona, was a catastrophic miscalculation in the context of an American courtroom. It alienated the jury, frustrated the judge, and ultimately played directly into the prosecution's hands, reinforcing their argument that he was an unrepentant and dangerous narcissist who respected no authority but his own. The spectacle was a daily feature on news broadcasts across the nation, captivating a public both horrified and fascinated by the man who had flooded their cities with drugs and now stood in a cage, shouting his defiance. After a trial that lasted for months, the jury's deliberation was relatively swift. The evidence was overwhelming and uncontroverted. They found Carlos Lehder guilty on all counts, including the most serious charge, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, a statute known as the Kingpin law that carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 135 years. The conviction was a landmark moment, a resounding message from the American judicial system that it would not tolerate such a direct and brazen assault on its sovereignty and the well-being of its citizens. The man who had dreamed of becoming a liberator of Latin America was now a condemned felon in the nation he hated most. His fate sealed not by a revolutionary court, but by a panel of 12 ordinary Americans. His life of unparalleled freedom and audacious criminality had reached its absolute legal terminus within the cold, unforgiving walls of a federal prison, a stark and humbling contrast to the sun-drenched power he had once wielded from his private island. A fall from grace so complete it seemed to mark not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. The imposing life plus sentence handed down to Carlos Lehder should have been the final period at the end of a long and violent story, consigning him to a forgotten existence in the deepest, most secure cell the American prison system could devise. For a time, that seemed to be his fate. He was initially incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, at the time the federal system's most secure and restrictive prison, designed to hold the nation's most incorrigible offenders. Life in Marion was a world away from the opulent excess of Hacienda Naples or the sovereign control of Norman's Cay. It was a monotonous, tightly controlled, and soul-crushing existence of concrete, steel, and unyielding routine. He was a high-profile inmate, known to both guards and prisoners, living in a state of constant, low-grade threat. Yet, even within this sterile and hopeless environment, Lehder's mind, ever restless and strategic, began to plot a new course. He understood that his only remaining currency, his only bargaining chip for any semblance of freedom or even a marginally improved quality of life, was the vast trove of information he carried in his memory. He knew the inner workings of the Medellín Cartel like no one else. He knew the locations of hidden laboratories, the names of corrupt officials in multiple countries, the intricacies of money laundering routes, the identities of assassins, and, most importantly, he held intimate knowledge about his former partners, including the elusive Pablo Escobar. The United States government, despite its victory in court, was still waging a desperate war against the cartel, which was at the peak of its terrifying power, unleashing a campaign of bombings and assassinations in Colombia that brought the nation to its knees. The DEA and the Department of Justice were hungry for any advantage, any piece of intelligence that could help them dismantle the organization. And so, a quiet, protracted negotiation began within the bowels of the federal prison system. Lehder, facing the certainty of dying in prison, began to talk. At first, his cooperation was tentative, a trickle of information, perhaps testing the waters to see what he might get in return. But as the years passed and the cartel's war intensified, the value of his cooperation skyrocketed. He provided prosecutors with the intricate details needed to indict and convict dozens of high-level traffickers, both in the United States and in Colombia. His testimony became a key that unlocked multiple investigations. The most significant turning point came after the death of Pablo Escobar in 1993. With the capo gone, Lehder's knowledge became even more crucial in mopping up the remaining cartel infrastructure and pursuing other kingpins. The U.S. government, recognizing the immense value of his continued cooperation, made a momentous decision. In a secret hearing, under the authority of the Federal Witness Protection Program, his life sentence was substantially reduced. The man, once deemed so dangerous that he required a life term without parole, was now being offered a chance at a future. The details of his sentencing modification remain sealed, but it is widely believed that his cooperation was so profound that it led to his eventual release. He was quietly moved out of the general prison population and into the shadowy, labyrinthine world of witness protection, a realm of new identities, relocated lives, and perpetual hiding. Carlos Lehder, the flamboyant revolutionary who had craved global notoriety, was now destined for a life of absolute anonymity. He had traded the empire he built for the one thing he could never have purchased with his billions of dollars: his freedom. This transaction, however, came with an incalculable cost. He was now one of the most hunted men in the criminal underworld, a traitor in the eyes of those who had once been his brothers in arms, his life forever dependent on the secrecy and protection of the government he had spent his life opposing. His final, shocking transformation from Kingpin to informant marked the ultimate demise of the revolutionary persona he had so carefully crafted, revealing a stark survival instinct that lay beneath the layers of ideology and ambition. The entry of Carlos Lehder into the Federal Witness Protection Program, known as WOIT SEC, represents one of the most profound and paradoxical conclusions in the annals of modern crime. It was an event that effectively erased one of the most recognizable and volatile figures of the late 20th century from the public record, replacing him with a ghost, a man of shadows and whispers. The process of his assimilation into this hidden world would have been a monumental undertaking, managed by the United States Marshal Service with a level of secrecy reserved for the most critical national security assets. His transformation began with a complete severing of his past. His iconic name, Carlos Lehder, was officially discarded, replaced by a new, bland, and utterly forgettable identity, complete with a fabricated personal history, a new birth certificate, social security number, and educational background designed to withstand casual scrutiny. His physical appearance, once so familiar from wanted posters and news broadcasts, was altered, perhaps through subtle changes in hairstyle, weight, dress, and demeanor, or through more permanent surgical means, all aimed at making him invisible in a crowd. he was relocated to an unknown community, almost certainly within the United States. A place with no connection to his previous life, a town or suburb where he could blend in as just another resident. The government provided him with a modest source of income, housing, and a structured program to build a new life, a stark and humble contrast to the palatial estates and private islands of his past. For a man who had thrived on notoriety, who had used media and grand gestures to build his public image, this enforced anonymity would have been a peculiar form of torture. The revolutionary who had penned fiery editorials could no longer express his views. The Kingpin who commanded armies of bodyguards now had to rely on the discretion of U.S. Marshals for his safety. His entire existence was now predicated on silence and conformity. The psychological adjustment to this new reality must have been immense. He traded the constant, adrenalized fear of a gunfight or a raid for the low, humming anxiety of being discovered, of a chance encounter with someone from his past, or a betrayal from within the very system protecting him. He lives with the eternal knowledge that contracts on his life, issued by former associates and the families of those he helped imprison, likely still exist. His continued survival is entirely dependent on his ability to remain a non-entity, to never draw attention to himself, to never repeat the mistakes of his past that were born from a craving for recognition. The man who sought to change the geopolitical landscape through cocaine is now powerless to effect any change, even in his own immediate neighborhood. His story, for all practical purposes, is over. The public record closes with his incarceration and subsequent cooperation. Any information about his current life, his thoughts, his health, or his family is speculation, locked away in classified government files. He exists now as a legal fiction, a testament to the ultimate power of the state to not only capture and convict, but to completely dismantle and reassemble a human life. His fate serves as a chilling postscript to the era of the cocaine cowboys, that no matter how high one climbs, how much wealth one amasses, or how much terror one inspires, the fall can be so complete that it leads not to martyrdom, but to oblivion. The legacy of Carlos Lehder is thus a double one. The flamboyant architect of a criminal revolution who lives on in history books and documentary films, and the anonymous, aging man living in a quiet house on an unknown street, a living ghost whose final chapter is written in invisible ink, a permanent prisoner of the past he created and the future he was forced to accept. To truly comprehend the colossal, almost geological impact of Carlos Lehder's criminal enterprise, one must look beyond the man himself and survey the permanent scars his actions left upon the world, a legacy etched in violence, shifted economies, and transformed global policies. His most immediate and devastating contribution was the industrialization of the cocaine trade, a process that took a niche, high-end vice and transformed it into a mass market commodity, fundamentally altering the social and criminal fabric of the United States and Latin America. Before Lehder's air bridge, cocaine was a drug for the elite, a symbol of disco, era excess that was too expensive and too difficult to obtain for widespread abuse. His logistical revolution changed the entire economic model by moving product in volumes previously thought impossible. He drove down the street price and increased availability exponentially, planting the seeds for the crack cocaine epidemic that would devastate American inner cities in the 1980s and 90s. The human cost of this is incalculable, measured in hundreds of thousands of lives lost to addiction, overdose, and the turf wars that erupted in American communities to control the new, highly profitable retail market. But the fallout was not confined to the United States. His homeland of Colombia was plunged into a period of darkness and bloodshed from which it has never fully recovered. The billions of dollars generated by the Medellín Cartel, fueled by Lehder's transportation network, corrupted the very foundations of Colombian society. Judges, police officers, politicians, and journalists were systematically bribed or murdered, eroding public trust in institutions and creating a culture of impunity for the wealthy and violent. The cartel's declaration of war against the state, a direct response to the threat of extradition that Lehder himself faced, led to a period of unprecedented terror. Car bombs in bustling city centers, the assassination of a presidential candidate, the bombing of an airliner, and the murder of countless innocent civilians. This era, known simply as La Violencia, is a national trauma that remains a raw wound in the Colombian psyche. Furthermore, Lehder's specific choice of the Bahamas as his hub corrupted an entire nation, turning a tourist paradise into a narco state where officials were bought and the rule of law was supplanted by the rule of the dollar. The environmental damage alone was significant, with pristine islands and coastal areas used as makeshift airstrips and transshipment points, leaving behind pollution and a legacy of lawlessness. On a global scale, Lehder's success directly prompted the militarization of the war on drugs. The United States, realizing that local police forces were outgunned and outmaneuvered by sophisticated international cartels, began to pour billions into interdiction efforts involving the CIA, the Pentagon, and sophisticated surveillance technology in a battle that was no longer just about law enforcement, but about national security. His model became the blueprint for every major trafficking organization that followed, from the Mexican cartels to criminal syndicates in Europe and Africa, proving that with enough audacity and organizational skill, a determined group could challenge the sovereignty of nations. And finally, his personal legacy is a study in contradiction and moral ambiguity. He is remembered by some in his home region of Quindio as a modern-day Robin Hood, a flawed benefactor who built roads and provided jobs, a narrative he actively cultivated. But this romanticized view is brutally offset by the mountains of cocaine that fueled addiction and the rivers of blood spilled in the name of his revolution. His ultimate decision to cooperate with the U.S. government while securing his own personal freedom cemented his status as a traitor in the criminal underworld and complicated his historical image, transforming him from a defiant revolutionary into a pragmatic survivor who chose self-preservation over ideology. The world we live in today, with its sophisticated global narcotics networks, its heavily armed cartels, and its ongoing, intractable debate over drug policy, is in no small part a world that Carlos Lehder helped to build. His story is not a relic of the past, it is a living, breathing cautionary tale about the unintended and catastrophic consequences that can arise from the fusion of one man's limitless ambition with a simple white powder. The psychological portrait of Carlos Lehder is as complex and fraught with contradiction as his criminal legacy. A tangled web of deep-seated insecurities, grand intellectual pretensions, and a desperate, lifelong search for an identity that could contain his colossal ambitions. To understand the man behind the myth, one must look past the tons of cocaine and the private army and into the formative experiences that forged a Kingpin. His foundational trauma was his rootlessness, the sense of not belonging that began with his parents' separation and was violently cemented by his displacement to the United States as a teenager. In America, he was an outsider, a young Colombian struggling with language and culture, and his subsequent incarceration in the American prison system for car theft only deepened this profound alienation, transforming a vague sense of not fitting into a seething, focused hatred for the nation he perceived as his jailer. It was from this cauldron of resentment that his entire worldview was forged. His subsequent adoption of radical political ideologies was not, as he claimed, a purely intellectual or philosophical pursuit. It was a psychological coping mechanism, a way to reframe his personal failures and criminal desires into a noble, political struggle. By casting himself as a revolutionary warrior fighting against Yankee imperialism, he could elevate his pursuit of wealth and power into a crusade, justifying any atrocity as a necessary sacrifice for a higher cause. His fascination with figures like Adolf Hitler and Juan Perón is particularly revealing. He was drawn to strongman leaders who wielded absolute power and commanded cult-like followings, something he desperately craved for himself. His newspaper, Quindu Today, was less a legitimate publication and more a megaphone for his escalating megalomania, a place where he could style himself as a political thinker and a leader of men, a far cry from the reality of his life as a fugitive drug trafficker. This grandiosity was the flip side of his deep-seated insecurity. The more the world closed in on him, the more loudly he proclaimed his own importance. His flamboyant lifestyle, the zoo at Hacienda Naples, the parties on Norman's Cay, the public pronouncements, were all performances designed to convince both the world and himself of his own legend. Yet, this carefully constructed persona was brittle. His ultimate decision to become a government informant, to trade the secrets of his former comrades for a reduction in his sentence, shattered the revolutionary image completely. It revealed the core truth that beneath the layers of political rhetoric and anti-American vitriol, there was a primal instinct for self-preservation that outweighed any ideological commitment. The man who declared war on an empire was, in the end, unwilling to die for his cause. This final act completes his psychological profile, painting a picture of a man who was ultimately a consummate opportunist, using politics as a costume to dress up his criminal enterprise. and then discarding that costume when it no longer served his most basic need to survive. His life stands as a stark lesson in the dangers of unchecked ambition fueled by personal grievance, a demonstration of how a desperate need for identity and significance, when channeled through a brilliant but immoral mind, can unleash forces that ripple across continents and decades, leaving a trail of destruction that long outlives the man himself. To fully appreciate the operational genius of Carlos Lehder, one must dissect the mechanics of his cocaine highway with the cold precision of an engineer, for it was in the logistical details that his true revolution was wrought. Before his intervention, the smuggling of cocaine was an artisanal, high-risk, low-volume affair, reliant on mullahs, individuals who would ingest condoms filled with the drug or hide small quantities in their luggage on commercial flights. This method was inherently limited, susceptible to airport security, and could never hope to meet the exploding demand of the American market. Lehder's paradigm shift was to look at a map and see not borders, but a logistical flowchart. His time in a U.S. prison had given him not just the idea, but the connections, specifically George Jung, who provided the initial link to Colombian suppliers. But Lehder's vision was far grander than Jung's. He identified the Bahamas not as a destination, but as the perfect logistical pivot point, a string of islands under British jurisdiction, but with a level of local autonomy and corruption that could be exploited, located like a stepping stone between South America and the Florida coast. His masterstroke was the acquisition and fortification of Norman's Cay. He didn't just use the island, he weaponized it. He transformed its airstrip into a dedicated narcotics port, a secure hub where large, twin-engine aircraft like the Learjet 35, loaded with hundreds of kilos of cocaine in Colombia, could land, refuel, and transfer their cargo to smaller, lighter planes better suited for clandestine, low-altitude flights into the swampy, radar-blind areas of the Florida coastline. This hub and spoke model was a direct lift from corporate logistics, applied with brutal efficiency to the drug trade. He organized his operation like a military campaign. He employed a fleet of pilots, paying them enormous sums, but binding them in a code of silence, enforced by the very real threat of death. He had ground crews on the island and in Florida who would swiftly unload the planes, often in the dead of night, transferring the drugs to waiting vehicles for distribution. He established sophisticated communications networks, using coded language and frequently changing frequencies to avoid detection. The financial architecture was equally innovative. The sheer volume of cash generated was unprecedented. He pioneered methods of money laundering, initially using the Bahamas' loose banking laws to deposit millions, and later, as scrutiny increased, moving to more complex systems involving shell companies, false invoices, and the purchase of legitimate businesses to commingle his illicit profits with legal revenue. His operation, which he christened La Corporación, was indeed one of the world's first truly multinational criminal corporations, with a CEOs, Lehder, a board of directors, the Medellín Cartel partners, dedicated departments for transportation, security and finance, and a global supply chain. The efficiency was staggering. At its peak, it is estimated that Lehder's network was responsible for smuggling between 300 and 500 kilos of cocaine into the United States every single day. This was not mere smuggling, it was wholesale importation on an industrial scale. He effectively created a commodity pipeline, and in doing so, he broke the old model and established a new corporate standard for international drug trafficking that every major cartel since has been forced to emulate. His genius was not in creating a new drug, but in re-engineering the entire system of its delivery, solving the problem of transcontinental, illicit logistics in a way that governments were initially completely unprepared to counter. This logistical blueprint, more than any political manifesto or act of violence, is his most enduring and damaging legacy, a dark masterpiece of criminal innovation that forever changed the balance of power between law enforcement and the underworld, the immense, almost unimaginable wealth that flooded into Carlos Lehder's coffers as a result of his logistical revolution did not merely buy him luxury. It purchased a level of influence and audacity that allowed him to live as a de facto head of state, creating a parallel world where his will was law and his whims were reality. The billions of dollars, once successfully laundered and consolidated, were deployed not just for self-indulgence, but as strategic tools to build and fortify his power, both hard and soft. His most famous acquisition, the Hacienda Naples, was far more than a private residence. It was a sprawling, 3,000-acre sovereign kingdom, a physical manifestation of his power and his eccentricities. The estate, complete with its own airport capable of handling the large aircraft used in his smuggling operations, became the symbolic heart of his empire. The now iconic entrance gate, topped with a small replica airplane, was a blatant, mocking tribute to the source of his wealth. Within its borders, he created a surreal personal universe, building a vast zoo stocked with exotic animals like hippos, giraffes, and elephants, creatures alien to the Colombian landscape, much like he felt alien in the world. This menagerie was a symbol of his global reach, his ability to pluck creatures from their native habitats and transplant them into his own private domain. He installed whimsical, life-sized statues of dinosaurs, projecting an image of primordial power and a kingdom that existed outside of conventional time. Hacienda Naples was the stage for legendary parties that lasted for days, attended by a dizzying array of guests: corrupt politicians, local beauty queens, international celebrities, and his cartel partners, all mingling in an atmosphere of decadent, unchecked power. But beyond the spectacle, Lehder used his wealth to wage his political war. He bankrolled his Latin nationalist movement with millions, using his newspaper, Quindu Today, as a propaganda arm to spread his anti-American, anti-extradition message directly to the Colombian people. He would often be seen in the city of Armenia, his home region, distributing money to the poor, presenting himself as a benefactor, a modern-day Robin Hood, taking from the greedy Americans and giving to his own people. This calculated philanthropy was a masterful public relations campaign designed to build a popular base of support that would, he hoped, provide a human shield against the government and the gringos. His spending on security was equally monumental. He maintained a private army of bodyguards, often recruited from former military and police, equipped with weapons that rivaled those of the Colombian armed forces. He owned a fleet of cars, boats, and aircraft, not just for transport, but for rapid escape and to move his product. This flamboyant public life, however, was a double-edged sword. While it built his legend and cultivated a degree of local loyalty, it also made him a glaring target. The very public nature of his wealth and political activities was a direct challenge to the authority of the Colombian state and an irresistible provocation to the United States. He was not hiding, he was taunting. He lived by the principle that the best defense was a bold offense, believing that his wealth and popular support could insulate him from the consequences of his actions. This belief would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, as the very notoriety he cultivated became the beacon that guided his enemies directly to his door. The story of Lehder's wealth is therefore not just a tale of obscene luxury, but a critical chapter in the history of narco power, demonstrating how illicit fortunes can be used to create parallel states, corrupt public opinion, and temporarily suspend the normal rules of society until the weight of reality comes crashing back down. The violent unraveling of Carlos Lehder's empire cannot be understood without examining the intricate and relentless web of international law enforcement that was woven to ensnare him, a multi-agency, multi-national effort that evolved in direct response to the unprecedented threat he represented. This was not a simple police investigation. It was a protracted campaign, a slow and methodical siege against a fortress of money, violence, and corruption. The initial alarm bells were sounded by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, whose agents in Florida began to notice a dramatic and inexplicable surge in the purity and availability of cocaine on the streets in the late 1970s. Through traditional investigative work, intercepting communications, flipping low-level traffickers, and following the money, a pattern began to emerge, one that consistently pointed south, towards the Bahamas and a mysterious figure known as Joe Lehder. The investigation, codenamed Operation Grouper, became one of the DEA's highest priorities, but the DEA could not act alone. Lehder's operations spanned jurisdictions, so the investigation necessarily became a complex international tapestry. The FBI was brought in to handle the racketeering and organized crime aspects within the U.S. The U.S. Customs Service tracked his aircraft and vessels. The Internal Revenue Service launched a massive financial investigation, following the labyrinthine money trails in an attempt to dismantle the economic infrastructure of La Corporación. Crucially, the cooperation of the Bahamian government was secured, albeit slowly and with great difficulty, as Lehder had deeply corrupted elements within the local power structure. The breakthrough in the Bahamas came with a change in government and relentless diplomatic pressure from Washington, which eventually led to raids on Norman's Cay and the seizure of assets crippling Lehder's primary logistical hub. Simultaneously, the Colombian National Police, under increasing pressure from their own government and the U.S., began their own parallel investigation, tracking Lehder's movements and assets within Colombia, a dangerous task that cost the lives of many officers. The investigation was a masterclass in intelligence sharing and interagency cooperation, albeit one born out of sheer necessity. They employed every tool at their disposal: aerial surveillance of his properties, wiretaps on his associates' phones, and the cultivation of informants within his organization. The case against him was built piece by painstaking piece, a mosaic of evidence that included flight plans, fuel receipts from Norman's Cay, bank records from shell companies, and the sworn testimonies of pilots and money launderers who had been arrested and offered deals in exchange for their cooperation. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, designed to be impervious to the kind of legal challenges a man of Lehder's wealth could mount. The indictment that was finally unsealed against him in Florida was a sweeping document, charging him under the powerful Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allowed prosecutors to treat his entire organization as a single criminal enterprise. It was this massive, coordinated, and patient effort that transformed Lehder from an untouchable kingpin living in a fortified palace into a hunted fugitive, forcing him to abandon his public life and go into hiding. The man who had controlled a private air force and an island nation was now reduced to moving between safe houses, his world shrinking with each passing day as the combined might of two nations' law enforcement agencies closed in, proving that no criminal, no matter how powerful or innovative, could ultimately withstand the focused and persistent application of state power. The ideological framework that Carlos Lehder constructed around his criminal enterprise was not a mere afterthought or a public relations stunt. It was the central pillar of his self-justification, a convoluted and often contradictory philosophy that he used to transmute base greed and a thirst for power into a noble political crusade. To understand Lehder the man, one must wade into the murky waters of his personal ideology, a bizarre synthesis of historical revisionism, anti-American vitriol, and a self-styled messianic complex. His beliefs were heavily influenced by his German heritage and his father's likely nationalist sentiments, which mutated in Lehder's mind into a fervent admiration for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime's perceived strength and nationalistic purity. This was grotesquely combined with a fervent pan-Latin American nationalism, inspired by figures like Simón Bolívar and Argentine President Juan Perón, whose populist and anti-imperialist rhetoric resonated with him. He saw himself as the heir to this conflicted legacy, a man destined to unite Latin America against its northern oppressor, the United States. In his worldview, cocaine was not a drug of addiction and destruction. It was the Latin A-bomb, a revolutionary weapon that could simultaneously bankrupt the American economy, corrupt its youth, and fund his political and military ambitions. He articulated this vision repeatedly in the pages of his newspaper, Quindio Today, publishing rambling manifestos that mixed half-digested political theory with paranoid conspiracy theories and outright historical falsehoods. He argued that the extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States was a form of modern-day colonialism, a violation of national sovereignty that allowed the gringos to pluck Colombian citizens from their homeland. His proposed solution, which he presented to the Colombian government, was audacious in its delusion. He would use his personal fortune to pay off Colombia's entire multi-billion-dollar foreign debt in exchange for the abolition of extradition and political asylum for himself and his cartel partners. This offer, a stark embodiment of his plata o plomo philosophy on a national scale, was summarily rejected. But it revealed the depth of his grandiosity. He genuinely believed that his wealth entitled him to reshape the geopolitical landscape, to negotiate with nations as an equal power. This ideology, however, was fatally flawed by its inherent hypocrisy. While he railed against American imperialism, he lived a life steeped in American pop culture, driving American muscle cars and using American-made aircraft and technology to build his empire, while he posed as a champion of the Latin American poor. His actions plunged the entire region into a cycle of violence and corruption from which it is still recovering. His revolution was always, first and foremost, a business, and his ideology was its marketing department. When faced with the ultimate test, life imprisonment in an American prison, the revolutionary facade crumbled instantly, revealing the pragmatic survivor beneath. His subsequent cooperation with the U.S. government was the ultimate betrayal of every principle he had so loudly proclaimed. The man who vowed to destroy America with his Latin A bomb ultimately saved himself by giving its justice system the keys to dismantle his own organization. His ideology, therefore, stands as a cautionary tale about the power of self-deception, demonstrating how a brilliant mind can construct an elaborate intellectual fortress to justify its own darkest impulses. A fortress that can seem impregnable from the inside, but is revealed to be a house of cards at the first true gust of wind. The capture and prosecution of Carlos Lehder sent seismic shockwaves through the global criminal underworld, fundamentally altering the strategies, alliances, and very nature of high-level international drug trafficking. His fall was not just the end of one man's reign. It was a pivotal lesson that forced every other major trafficker to recalibrate their approach to business and security. The first and most immediate impact was on the Medellín Cartel itself. Lehder's arrest and subsequent extradition proved that no one, not even a founding partner with a private army and a populist following, was untouchable. It shattered the aura of invincibility that Pablo Escobar and the others had so carefully cultivated. While the cartel would continue its violent war for several more years, Lehder's removal was a critical blow to its logistical heart. More importantly, his decision to cooperate with U.S. authorities introduced a new and terrifying variable into the calculus of organized crime: the potential for a top-tier insider to become a witness for the prosecution. This fear of betrayal began to poison the well of trust within the cartel, fostering paranoia and internal suspicion that would eventually contribute to its fragmentation. For other criminal organizations, particularly the rising Cali Cartel, Lehder's story served as a masterclass in what not to do. The Cali bosses, the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers, and Jose Santa Cruz Londono were meticulous, low-profile businessmen who operated on a plata over plomo model. They observed Lehder's flamboyant, confrontational style and saw it as a recipe for disaster. They understood that drawing the focused wrath of the United States government was bad for business. Consequently, the Cali Cartel perfected a strategy of stealth and corruption, embedding themselves in the legitimate economy and bribing officials at the highest levels, avoiding the public declarations of war that had made Lehder and Escobar such high priority targets. On a global scale, Lehder's industrial scale air bridge became the new standard, but his centralized model of a single, fortified hub like Norman's Cay was abandoned as too vulnerable. Trafficking networks became more decentralized, cellular, and agile, using a constantly shifting array of routes through multiple countries to avoid the kind of focused interdiction that had doomed his Bahamian operation. The psychological impact on a generation of traffickers was profound. The image of Lehder, the self-proclaimed revolutionary, being led away in handcuffs and then testifying against his former comrades, was a sobering demonstration of the limits of criminal power. It proved that the state, when sufficiently motivated and organized, could and would project its power across borders and bring even the most powerful kingpins to justice. This led to a new era of criminal conservatism, where the goal was not to challenge the state openly, but to become so deeply enmeshed within it, through corruption and stealth, as to be indistinguishable from it. Lehder's legacy, therefore, is not just the empire he built, but the cautionary tale his downfall provided. He was the archetypal, flamboyant cocaine cowboy, whose very public rise and fall taught the next generation of narcos the value of silence, anonymity, and the perils of believing their own propaganda. The kingpins who followed, from the shadowy bosses of the Cali Cartel to the even more violent and fragmented leaders of the Mexican cartels, learned from his mistakes, making them in many ways more resilient, more sophisticated, and in some respects, even more dangerous, because they operated not from a throne on a private island, but from the shadows, where they were far harder to find and far harder to destroy. The story of Carlos Lehder would be incomplete without examining the profound and lasting consequences his actions had on the geopolitical relationship between the United States and Latin America, particularly Colombia, reshaping diplomacy and spawning a war whose echoes are still felt today. Lehder's very existence as a powerful, politically motivated narco trafficker forced a fundamental re-evaluation of the drug trade in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. It was no longer seen as a law enforcement issue confined to border states and major cities. It was now framed as a national security threat, an asymmetric war being waged against the American homeland by foreign criminal entities with nearly limitless resources. This shift in perception directly led to the militarization of the war on drugs. The United States began to pour billions of dollars into Colombia through aid packages like the Andean Initiative and later, the monumental Plan Colombia. This was not merely financial aid, it involved the deployment of U.S. military advisors, intelligence agents from the CIA and DEA, and the provision of advanced weaponry, surveillance technology, and Black Hawk helicopters to the Colombian military and national police. The U.S. footprint on Colombian soil became a permanent and deeply controversial feature of bilateral relations, with many in Latin America viewing it as a new form of Yankee imperialism. Exactly the kind of foreign intervention that Lehder had railed against, thus creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Colombian government was caught in an impossible position. On one hand, it was fighting for its very survival against the cartel's campaign of terror, and U.S. assistance was crucial. On the other hand, this reliance on the United States often came with strings attached, undermining its sovereignty and fueling the anti-American sentiment that traffickers like Lehder exploited for recruitment and popular support. The policy of extradition, which Lehder so feared, became the central pillar of Colombia's strategy, but it also became the cartel's primary target, leading to the assassination of hundreds of judges, journalists, and politicians, including the 3 presidential candidates and the bombing of the Diaz building, the Colombian intelligence headquarters. The violence was so extreme that it brought Colombia to the brink of being considered a failed state. Furthermore, the sheer economic power of the cartels, built on Lehder's logistical model, created a parallel economy that distorted Colombia's legitimate financial system, caused the peso to wildly fluctuate, and corrupted the political class to its core, leading to the crisis that saw President Ernesto Samper's administration investigated for accepting cartel money. The term narcoterrorism entered the global lexicon largely because of the Medellín Cartel's actions, and this fusion of drug trafficking and political violence became a template for other organizations worldwide. The entire Andean region was destabilized, with coca cultivation and trafficking spreading into Peru and Bolivia, creating a balloon effect, where pressure in one area simply caused the problem to expand elsewhere. The legacy of this period is a relationship between the United States and Colombia that remains inextricably linked by the drug war, a partnership born from the fire of a conflict that Carlos Lehder helped to ignite. His personal war against America, though ultimately a failure, succeeded in drawing the two nations into a deeper, more complex, and often fraught entanglement that has defined their interactions for decades, proving that the ambitions of a single, determined individual, when channeled through the prism of a global illicit industry, can indeed alter the course of international relations and set the stage for a conflict with no end in sight. The final, almost spectral chapter of Carlos Lehder's life, his existence within the federal witness protection program, raises profound and unsettling questions about justice, redemption, and the ultimate price of survival. His current status, as a man presumed alive and living under an assumed identity, is a closed book, its pages sealed by the U.S. government for his protection and to preserve the integrity of the program. We can only speculate on the contours of this hidden life, but it is almost certainly a world defined by its stark contrasts to his past. The man who once commanded a fleet of aircraft now likely drives an ordinary car on mundane errands. The Kingpin who held court at Hacienda Naples now resides in an anonymous suburban home, its architecture and location chosen for their utter forgettability. The revolutionary who sought to sway nations with his newspaper now remains scrupulously silent, his opinions, if he still holds any, confined to his own mind, or perhaps shared only with the government, appointed handlers who manage his case. His days are likely governed by a strict set of rules. No contact with anyone from his former life. No discussion of his past, no travel that could draw attention, and a perpetual vigilance against the ever-present threat of discovery. The psychological burden of this existence must be immense. He lives with the knowledge that he is one of the most infamous turncoats in criminal history, that his testimony sent countless former associates to prison for life, and that there are undoubtedly those who would spend a fortune to find him and exact revenge. The flamboyant ego that once demanded global recognition must now be perpetually suppressed. A wild animal caged within a psyche that is forced to project bland normality. There can be no true redemption in such a life, only a protracted and guarded retirement. He traded his empire, his notoriety, and his very identity for the most basic of human desires, to wake up the next morning. This transaction strips away any romantic notion of his revolutionary fervor, revealing it as a costume he wore until it became a liability. His legacy, therefore, is split into two irreconcilable halves: the public figure of historical record, the bold, reckless, and ideologically driven pioneer of the cocaine trade, and the private, invisible man, the informant who chose self-preservation over principle, anonymity over legend. He serves as the ultimate example of the state's power to not only punish, but to dismantle and reassemble a human life, to reduce a figure of epic criminal proportions to a mere administrative file. His story does not end with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow fading into the background noise of ordinary American life. He is a living ghost, a permanent prisoner of the witness protection system, a man who cheated a life sentence in a concrete cell, only to accept a life sentence in a gilded cage of his own making, forever looking over his shoulder, forever haunted by the colossal shadow of the man he once was, a ghost tormented by the memory of his own ghost. Beyond the personal saga of Carlos Lehder lies a broader cultural and historical footprint, a legacy etched not only in law enforcement tactics and international policy, but also in the global imagination, where his life story has been absorbed, fictionalized, and transformed into a potent modern myth. His rise and fall provided a narrative template so dramatic and archetypal that it has fueled a vast ecosystem of books, documentaries, and Hollywood screenplays, shaping the public's understanding of the narcotics trade for decades. He is often portrayed as the wild, ideological counterpart to the more coldly pragmatic Pablo Escobar, the dreamer whose vision enabled the empire that the businessman then perfected and expanded. The iconic image of Norman's Cay as a sovereign narco-state, a tropical paradise corrupted into a fortified smuggling hub, has become a staple of crime lore, a symbol of the audacious heights a criminal can reach before the inevitable fall. His specific persona, the trafficker with a political manifesto, the kingpin who saw himself as a revolutionary, added a complex, intellectual, and deeply unsettling dimension to the figure of the drug lord, moving it beyond a simple caricature of greed and violence into the realm of ideological warfare. This has influenced countless fictional portrayals in film and television, where drug traffickers are often given elaborate, if twisted, philosophical justifications for their actions, a direct inheritance from Lehder's own prolific propagandizing. Furthermore, his story serves as a critical case study in the unintended consequences of the war on drugs itself. His logistical model, which so efficiently flooded the American market with cocaine, directly led to the crack epidemic of the 1980s, which in turn triggered a wave of punitive domestic legislation that filled American prisons to bursting and devastated minority communities, creating a social crisis whose effects are still being reckoned with today. The immense profits from his trade also demonstrated to the world the staggering financial power of the drug economy, enticing a new generation of criminals and corrupting governments from Mexico to West Africa, creating a globalized network of illicit finance that continues to challenge international stability. His life is a stark illustration of the balloon effect in drug policy, where successful pressure on one route or organization simply causes the trade to shift elsewhere, often with increased violence and sophistication. The story of Carlos Lehder is, therefore, not a closed chapter in a history book. It is a living narrative that continues to inform debates about drug legalization, criminal justice reform, and the limits of state power. He is a symbol of a specific moment in time when the cocaine trade exploded into a global phenomenon, but his legacy is the enduring architecture of that phenomenon. The hidden, anonymous man in witness protection is a ghost, but the ghost continues to haunt the systems he helped to create, a reminder of the profound and often catastrophic impact a single, determined, and brilliantly flawed individual can have on the course of history, leaving behind a world permanently altered by his ambition, his innovation, and his ultimate, profound failure. As we near the conclusion of this extensive exploration, it is essential to distill the core lessons from the tumultuous life of Carlos Lehder, to extract the universal truths that lie buried within the mountains of cocaine, the stacks of currency, and the trail of blood he left behind. His story stands as a timeless, albeit dark, parable about the nature of ambition, the seduction of power, and the inescapable consequences of building an empire on a foundation of sand. The first and most glaring lesson is the inherent instability of a life in conflict with the world. Lehder's entire existence was a war. First, a personal war against the American society that alienated him. Then a commercial war against rival traffickers. And finally, a declared war against the governments of the United States and Colombia. A life perpetually at war is unsustainable. It consumes vast resources, demands constant vigilance, and inevitably attracts a powerful and organized enemy. His belief that his wealth and cunning could shield him from the concerted might of nation states was a fatal delusion, one shared by many kingpins who followed him. The second lesson is the corrosive nature of absolute power on the human psyche. The same visionary mind that conceived of the cocaine highway became increasingly detached from reality, intoxicated by its own creation. The flamboyant displays of wealth, the political grandstanding, the belief that he could single-handedly pay off a nation's debt. These were not the actions of a strategic criminal mastermind, but of a man whose ego had swollen to monstrous proportions, blinding him to the practical dangers he faced. His ideology, while passionately held, served primarily as a justification for this ego, a narrative he constructed to cast himself as the hero of his own story. Rather than the villain, he was in the eyes of the law and his countless victims. The third lesson is the ultimate fragility of criminal empires. For all its corporate structure, military might, and corruptive influence, La Corporación was not a legitimate state. It could not withstand the loss of its leader, the betrayal of its members, or the focused application of state power. Its wealth, while vast, was a liability as much as an asset, creating a trail that investigators could follow and making it a target for everyone from rival gangs to government confiscation. The final, and perhaps most poignant, lesson is the emptiness of the prize he fought so hard to win. His billions of dollars bought him a life of paranoia, forcing him into hiding long before his official capture. His power made him a target, isolating him in a fortress of his own making. His notoriety ultimately led to his imprisonment and the complete erasure of his identity. The man who sought to become a historical figure achieved that goal, but not in the way he intended. He is remembered not as a liberator, but as a cautionary tale, a symbol of excess and ruin. In the end, the revolutionary who sought to challenge empires was reduced to begging for a deal from his captors, trading every principle he ever professed for a chance to live out his days in silent, anonymous obscurity. The story of Carlos Lehder is, therefore, a profound tragedy in the classical sense, the story of a man of great talent and drive whose fatal flaws, his hubris, his resentment, and his capacity for self-deception led him on a path of self-destruction so complete that it obliterated the very self he sought to glorify, leaving behind only the ghost of a legend and the enduring scars of his passage through history. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that began with a disclaimer and a hook, and now concludes with a reflection and a final call to action. We have traversed the entire landscape of a life that reads like a dark epic, from the dislocated childhood in Colombia and New York, through the formative years in an American prison, to the audacious creation of a cocaine highway that reshaped global crime. We witnessed the rise of the Kingpin on his private island, the flamboyant displays of wealth and power at Hacienda Naples, and the dangerous descent into a self-proclaimed revolutionary war against the United States. We followed the relentless international manhunt, the dramatic capture in the Colombian countryside, the landmark trial in a Florida courtroom, and the shocking transformation from an unrepentant ideologue into a cooperating witness who traded his empire for his freedom. And we have contemplated the final, anonymous existence of a man erased and reborn in the Witness Protection Program, a living ghost forever haunted by the colossal shadow of his own past. The story of Carlos Lehder is more than a biography. It is an intricate tapestry woven with threads of ambition, innovation, violence, corruption, and ultimate, profound failure. It serves as a powerful reminder of the double-edged sword of human potential, how a brilliant and visionary mind, when untethered from morality and fueled by resentment, can unleash forces that cause untold suffering and leave indelible scars on nations and generations. His legacy is a world where the drug trade operates on an industrial scale, where criminal organizations wield power that rivals states, and where the war he helped ignite continues to burn with no end in sight. But his story also carries a message about the resilience of the rule of law, demonstrating that no individual, no matter how powerful or wealthy, is beyond its reach, and that the pursuit of justice, though often slow and imperfect, is a relentless force that eventually balances the scales. As this narrative closes, we return to the purpose with which we began, to present a comprehensive account, collected from diverse sources for your information and reflection. If this deep, factual journey into the heart of one of history's most compelling criminal lives has held your attention, if it has provided you with a clearer understanding of the complex forces that shape our world, then our objective has been met. The story of Carlos Lehder is now part of your knowledge, but the world is filled with countless other such stories, other intricate tales of power, crime, and consequence waiting to be explored and understood. If you wish to continue this journey of discovery with us, to delve into other meticulously researched accounts that go beyond the headlines, then your support is invaluable. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. By doing so, you ensure that you do not miss our future explorations. Your engagement is what fuels this mission to bring correct and compelling information directly to you. Thank you for your time and your attention. This is the story of Carlos Lehder.